Good evening, everyone. I'm Councillor Yvonne Say, and I'm the Chair of the Pensions Committee and Board. Please note that this meeting is recorded by the Council for live and subsequent broadcasts on the Council's internet site. I'll begin by asking members of the committee to introduce themselves. Councillor Caldwell.
Yes, I'm Councillor Elbridge Caldwell. I'm the Child Union.
And Vice Chair. Councillor Denison.
I'm Councillor Paul Dennison and Councillor Highgate.
Councillor Ross.
Councillor Viv Ross, Fortis Green.
Ishmael Awarish.
Yes, that's me. I'm Ishmael Awarish. I'm an employee member.
And Randy Plowright.
Randy Plowright.
The officers, can we introduce the officers in the room first, please?
Thomas Skeen, Assistant Director of Finance.
Tim and Paul, Head of Pensions and Treasury.
Fiona Ray, Principal Committee Coordinator.
And now those who are attending virtually, can we start with Nigel?
Nigel Keel, Interim Pensions Manager.
And then Patrick?
Patrick Hughes, the Principal Lawyer, Legal Advisor to the committee.
And the representatives from Mercer, please. Steve?
So I think Steve is joining slightly later on, but Alex Goddard, so part of the investment consulting team at Mercer.
Thank you. Apologies for absence. We've had apologies from Keith Brown, Craig Patterson, and John Madison. And item 3 on the agenda: urgent business. We have no urgent business.
No.
Item 4 on the agenda: declarations of interest and conflicts of interest. Do members have any declarations of interest or conflicts of interest to declare? No? Item 5 on the agenda: deputations, petitions, presentations, questions.
There have been none, Chair.
Item 6, record of training undertaken since the last meeting. To note, any training undertaken since the last meeting. Can I ask members or officers to update the committee on training undertaken?
Yes, Chair, I'm happy to do so. So just to begin with, on the 21st of July, we carried out, myself and the independent advisor carried out some training to the new members of the committee on board, just on induction, basically the basics of LD and how it fits within that. And then subsequent to the beginning of this meeting, we got training on multi-asset credit. So just for the record.
Item 7, membership. And I now invite officers to introduce the report.
Right, thank you, Chair. We don't actually have a report for this item, but just to provide an update to the committee. So earlier this year, we, myself, the Deputy Director of Finance and then Chair of the Pensions Committee on Board, conducted the selection process to appoint a new employee representative to be a member of the Pensions Committee on Board. As some of you will be aware, that's been a process in breaking for a very long time. But we're very pleased that 3 people came forward and we carried out interviews. And on the basis of the interviews and the experience that was showcased on the day, we are recommending to the committee that they confirm Craig Patterson as the employee representative for a term of 4 years. Great. Thank you.
So can I ask the committee and board to confirm Craig Patterson as an employee member for 4-year term of office? Is that great? Yes, thank you. Item 8, minutes. Do we have any comments of the minutes from the 4th of March 2021? But that's the public minutes only at this point, and whether we can agree with them.
Yeah. Thank you. Just on the progress of recruitment of the vacancy for the apprentice, it's at item 9. I know it's also at item 9, also on page 14 of the report, which is the next item that we take. But I just wondered if there was any progress at all. So at the moment, there isn't an update in terms of we haven't hired an apprentice. Given that the long-standing pensions manager has now retired, we're looking at how best we can restructure that team. So in the item where we do the pension administration report, Nigel's going to take us through some of the processes that are currently underway. So we'll be able to discuss that in more detail.
I was going to ask that as well, but I've got another question. On page 7, third paragraph, last sentence, talks about the accounts being signed off, and there was a delay, I think. The accounts being signed off because of COVID, and all councils' accounts.
So the accounts for the previous financial year have now been signed off. So they have been published, and it's a fair opinion. This current process, we are not sure yet because we've not had the auditors come to us and publish what the audit work plan, but we believe that they'll be during next month, and then put them on the agenda, give us the plan. We expect it's going to be delayed again, but hopefully they should be done by the time we have our March meeting. We'll keep you updated.
March meeting. We're not having a meeting between now and March. Our last meeting was March.
Yes, so we are having a meeting between now and March just to confirm. But the accounts may not be ready for the auditors until March. Yes.
Councillor Caldwell.
Does that not disturb any plan by not having a solid audit of what we can and cannot do and cannot implement?
No, so the external audit looks at the accounts from the previous year and sees whether the way that we put the accounts together is of basically we've not done anything that is incorrect or that might be not consistent with the standards of accounting. So the auditors need time to go through that work. They'll ask myself and some people on my team questions about how we compile those numbers. And then essentially they'll come with an opinion, which they will then feed back to the committee. So you'll have an opportunity to ask them why they're giving that opinion. The issue that we're having is because of the ongoing pandemic and people being working remotely, it's taking longer than normal. Usually at this meeting, should come and say the accounts are ready and the auditor will be here to present, but unfortunately, it's taken slightly longer this time around. So we will keep you updated on the progress. The only thing for today is the draft accounts for initial.
And have you factored in the fact that the COVID might go on? Then what? Then?
Yes, I think that's an open question that a lot of people are considering. This part of the process is not something that we can control. The external auditors are the ones who they're already the accounts. We produce our accounts as a deadline has been set, but unfortunately, we have to go through the process.
They will then be able to explain the likely time fails for some projects. I think it's important to know that our accounts have very clearly reason. We have no reasons to concern there. The objective the end of that. I think it's also important to say that most councils did not meet the deadlines last year. It's a national issue to make accounts in the sector. So that just hopefully gives some context to what's going
on. Sorry, just one other thing. Just on the forward plan, point 17, we were talking about the TCFD, which is the Task Force and Climate Related Plan Disclosure. It's in the forward plan in November as a TCFD consultation. Is that what we decided to do? I can't remember.
No, so I think the decision at the previous meeting was a training session on TCFD. Unfortunately, there's been a big change in the committee membership. So this meeting, we would have liked to work to this meeting, but we want to discuss other items such as the multi-asset credit.
Yeah.
We'll be bringing that forward to the November meeting. So that's in the forward plan. There is actually an update that we'll be sharing with you as part of this update that we will be. So there is progress in terms of what that TCFD will look like, and essentially the companies will come forward with the consultation, which will be invited to come. So when we get to that item, I can talk and give more detail about that as well.
I have myself too much.
Sorry.
So can we agree the minutes? Yes. Item 9 on the agenda, pension administration report. And I now invite officers to introduce the report. Lead officer Nigel Peel.
Thank you, Chair. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Nigel Keogh. I am the Interim Pensions Manager. This is my first opportunity to meet members of the Pensions Committee and Board, and so it's a pleasure to meet you all. I joined the organisation in July and have been working primarily on looking at the issues of the resourcing of the pensions team going forward, which is covered in this report, and to pick up on the earlier comments regarding the recruitment of an apprentice. That is certainly very much still part of our plans. In fact, I actually think it's crucial to the long-term stability of the pensions administration team that we continue to recruit and train our own people wherever possible. So we are in the process of pulling together a comprehensive recruitment plan, as the report points out, that will not only find a replacement, a permanent replacement for the pensions manager, but also seek to replace some very experienced members of staff who are due to retire over the next 3 months or so. The issue we have with regards to the recruitment of an apprentice at the same time is that what that role will really entail is a lot of face-to-face training. It's something that's going to be very difficult to integrate someone into the pensions team whilst we are working remotely. And so we need to think carefully about how we manage the transition of the team back into the office so that that training can take place at least partially on a face-to-face basis. And this is part of a wider discussion across the organisation about the return to work, and also the limitations that the refurbishment of office accommodation places on that. So it's an evolving situation, and it's an ongoing conversation that I'm having with Tim and with Thomas, and and with colleagues across the organisation as to how actually we make that best happen. But I am hopeful that within the next couple of weeks we will be able to start the process of recruitment with a view to getting in the resources that the team needs on a long-term basis. So that was the first item I wanted to address in the report. The second item is with regards to the admission agreement for Lunchtime Catering Company, who successfully secured a contract for catering services at Devonshire Hill Nursery and Primary School. The current contractor has a number of staff who are members of the LGPS, and we need to ensure their continued membership by allowing Lunchtime Catering Company to participate within the scheme. So that is for the committee to note and approve. The final item on the agenda is with regards to Clerkenwell Parochial School, located in Islington. Clerkenwell Parochial School is a member of the LDBS Academy Trust, an academy trust which has several schools within Haringey's area, and are participants in the LGPS. The situation has arisen whereby the last active member within Clerkenwell has ceased or is due to cease, and as a consequence of which the school would be facing a large cessation payment to be made to Islington Pension Fund in respect of outstanding liabilities. After discussion with the actuary and between the officers ourselves, the most effective way to manage any potential risk that would be posed by this organisation having to disburse a large amount of cash rather than that cash going towards schooling would be for us to absorb Clerkenwell into the Haringey Pension Fund, subject, as the report says, to the school obtaining the necessary Secretary of State's direction and also subject to us finally confirming the numbers with our own actuary, as opposed to the numbers that have been supplied by Islington. That's what we are asking for the committee to do at this moment in time, is to note and agree that we proceed in that way, subject to all those conditions being met. And at that point, I will pause and ask the board committee if there are any questions.
Thank you. Nigel, it confused me that, and you actually confused me a little bit more now, because this is an Islington school and there must be an Islington pension scheme. And I understand when you say that some of the schools within this gym, some sort of academy trust or whatever, some of the schools are within Haringey. But it just seems bizarre that we would take on the pensioners, if you like, of a school in Islington. And you then confused me more when you said there's only one member and that member is ceasing. So I wonder if you could explain if they go from one member to no members in that school, why doesn't Islington pension scheme take up the slack?
The rules in the LGPS do say that once there are no active members, contributing members within an organisation, then the pension fund has to effectively close that scheme. So therefore, at that point in time, any deficit crystallises and has to be paid to the pension fund. Now, obviously, there will be assets and liabilities. There will be liabilities that will be in relation to deferred members and to pensioner members who were previously employed there. Consequently, all of those would be required to be met at one point in time as a consequence of scheme regulations. Now, we feel that has a potentially detrimental effect on the finances of the trust if they were to be forced into a position where they had to disperse this cash to Islington Pension Fund at one go, which might destabilise their ongoing ability to meet their liabilities to the Haringey Pension Fund, as they are all part of one organisation. So in order to better manage that risk, we can absorb the assets and liabilities in relation to Clerkenwell into the Haringey Pension Fund, and we can manage them accordingly going forward, rather than having to see this outflow of cash going out to the trust. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if anyone else is confused a bit.
Yeah. So I don't know. I have an attempt of trying to sort of explain it. So when the school ceases in Islington, it has to be closed, and then they'll do an assessment of their assets and liabilities.
I understand that, but the Islington pension scheme, I mean, if we were in the same position, we would have to absorb that.
Yes, so it's not the Islington that absorbs it, it's the employer. So they'll have to pay that. So the employer being the multi-trust academy, they'll have to essentially pay whatever that debt is to the Islington fund. However, they still have schools that are within our fund that are still open. If they pay that big amount of money, they might not be able to then pay the contributions to the schools that are in our fund. In Haringey. So essentially, a lot of the schools that are in, a lot of the schools for this academy are in Haringey. So that's why they sort of come to us and say, we've got this big debt to pay. But another option is actually allowed by the regulations is when they transfer that into our scheme, it's still going to be under the multi-trust academy as a sort of a pooled fund of their assets and liabilities. When we come to the next valuation next year, they actually again do a reassessment, and if they consider that risk, to increase the contribution rates. But essentially, it means that they're still able to make sure that those schools in our borough continue to.
And how many schools in Islington?
That's the only school.
Oh, that's the only school. Oh, that wasn't clear.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that makes it
Yes.
a lot clearer.
That's the only.
Sorry. My
Okay.
apologies. Yes, there is only the one school in Islington. The majority of the schools in the trust are actually in Haringey.
That makes more sense.
That makes far
Okay,
more.
my apologies.
I don't know, cut of Madrid. Oh, yeah. Let's see. All right. Okay. I've got no objections.
Okay, can I ask then that the committee go through the recommendations on the report? Sorry, but you go first.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to know how it got the large pension deficit in the first place, because I guess that's the concern for me, that actually we're taking on large debts. Like how we seem to be taking potentially bad management of something that like it's the best decision to make, but I'm just interested in kind of how they got to that position in the first place.
I'm not sure on the background. What I do know at the moment is that they are that school is actually paying a larger contribution rate and also deficit recovery contributions more than the schools within our own borough. So I can only assume that it's a historical position that they've been trying to recover.
Just to add to that, I think the academy, as they are quite small, there's not a huge number of members. You do just get sorts of say statistically random kind of funding positions for them. So if they have particularly old workforce, a particularly large number of pension members, they can just have large liabilities and poor funding positions. We don't know about this specific case. I don't think we know about strict how it's got that position. What we're saying is, based on the information it's a reasonable decision for us to absorb that with the existing costs.
We don't think it's going to have, like we said, we're going to have the actuary reassess and see whether they need to make any extra contributions. We don't think this is going to have a material effect on everybody's contributions next time. I think it will be tiny compared to the larger one.
It should not be on any other. It's specific to the employer, and before they even absorb that, what's going to happen is the actuary that they discuss with the institute actuaries. They're going to have to agree what the transfer is going to be, and then I'll get pulled in, and then the next valuation, check the contribution is based on the side of that.
So would we then take on the same monitoring role that we have in our own schools, whereby Janet is always saying that someone's been late paying this month, and I'm going to get onto them. And we'll have the same role, even though it's an Islington school.
No, so it won't be any Islington school anymore. It will be coming to our fund. So what we'll do every transfer, because we're moving those assets, they always come out of the Islington fund. We can't get cross-employer in the fund.
Oh, so we won't have anything to do with the school at all then, as such, other than if it's former members, it's former teachers who are now currently being paid by Islington Fund, and will start being paid by Haringey Fund.
Yes.
But there's no one else left in the school, so to speak, who's a member. Okay, yeah, okay.
Yes, it's interesting you spoke about apprenticeship. Is that yearly, and if so, how many apprentices or young people are given apprentice opportunities?
I'm sorry, I missed that. Could you say again?
Yes, you spoke about apprenticeships.
Yes.
I'd like to know, do you recruit yearly, and if you do, how many apprentice positions do you offer?
At the outset, we're looking to take on one apprentice, but then we will roll that program out as the work demands, and as also as other members of the pension team approach retirement age, and or other people leave, we need to think about how we develop that. And I think using apprentices and training them ourselves is one of the best ways to do it.
Are we talking young apprentices from school, or are we talking people that have been in employment for a while?
We are talking about using the modern apprenticeship scheme. So they could well be school leavers.
Thank you.
I don't think taken on an apprentice before. I don't think.
We have to I think it's important to remember that the team is less than 10 people, not huge to so yeah.
Okay, any more questions? No? Should we go through the recommendations then, please? There on page 13. The first one is to note this report gives an update on the plans of the future resourcing of pensions administration team. Is that noted? To note and approve the admission of Lunchtime Company Limited, Devonshire Hill Nursery and Primary School as a new employer to the pension fund, as set out in paragraph 6.3 of the report. Agreed? To note and agree to the bulk transfer of the Clerkenwell Parochial School's assets and liabilities into Harrogate Pension Fund in principle, subject to further actuarial assessments and the LDBS Academy Trust obtaining the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government direction order for the transfer to take place. If agreed to delegate to the Assistant Director of Finance, Deputy Section 151 Officer, to implement the transfer after consultation with the Chair of the Pensions Committee and Board, as set out in paragraph 6.4 to 6.7 of the report. Agreed? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We go on to item 10, pension fund quarterly update and investments update.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Happy to sort of do an introduction into the item. So the item I'm introducing now is the quarterly investment and performance update. This is the regular update we bring to the Pensions Committee and Board, just to give you an update on what's happening within the investments of the pension fund. So this report actually has a few appendices to it. There is an independent advisor market commentary. Unfortunately, the independent advisor is unable to join us today, but he's provided a report, which includes an annual report as well, which summarizes the investment market and is for members to note. And so, yeah, a bit more context of the environment that we're investing in. Just moving on to the other appendices that include, there is also the draft to the statement of accounts, but I'll get to that later on. What I'll do at this point is just go through the report and sort of highlight some of the key areas in the report. So the first thing to highlight is the investment asset allocation. That's on section 6.2. The main point is the fund is now about 1.7 billion in terms of its assets under sort of invested assets. That's an increase of 4.72% since March, which seems to be a really good thing, and likely seems to be on the back of economic reopening and the equity market, so doing very well. So the fund is now, I think, as high as it's been pre-COVID. So that's just for members to note. The next section is on table 2 of section 6.3. So at the last meeting, there were a few decisions that the committee agreed to, and this sort of just gives you an update on how those decisions that you agreed to, how they've been implemented and when. So just to advise members that all the decisions have now been implemented. A key one decision to note is the rapid multi-factor plan implementation strategy. Those who have been on the board before they realized that this is going on for a few years. It took time to get that fund launched, but so pleased to say that that fund is now launched and it's now up and running. So we're looking to forward to providing more of an update on how that performs. The investment performance is also included in section 6.4. In section 6.6, which covers part of the funding and position update, just to update the committee that the pension fund is now at a funding, estimated funding level of 110%. This is obviously a funding level that actually is carried in between years, so that might be subject to change with the full valuation next year. So just to give you an interim basis of where we were, comparing that with the last time there was a valuation, we were just very close to 100%. It looks like the funding levels are much more, much more advanced.
Did you say 110%?
110%, yes. And then on items 6.9 going onwards, under the heading of the London Collective Investment Vehicle update, there wasn't really much to update on this last quarter. Let's say that we have not invested in the renewables fund. has been launched, one of the first 4 funds across the MSCI that fund. And they actually did the second close again, I think, in July. So that fund is doing very well. But at the moment, they've only drawn down about a fraction of the money. So I think they're ready to be working that out in the next 3 quarters. The last thing I'll also mention on the TCFD reporting, which we'll cover in more detail later, but just to say that TCFD reporting is going to come. It's probably likely to be mandatory. So the team looking at ways in which they can support funds in producing that reporting. So just thought we'd highlight that. The last item that's included is the draft pension fund accounts in annual report, which has been appended as Appendix 4. It's a fairly lengthy document, so I won't go into in detail, but I'm sure members have read and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer some of those questions. But really, Chair, this is the update that I wish to sort of bring to members' attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Councillor Berman?
I think
Who's first? Councillor Ralston.
On 6.9, is that figure right? 80%?
Yes, so that figure, the actual figure is something like 77 or 78, so we just rounded it up to 80%. But that includes the passive equities. The London sort of calculate the process account. So the investments we have in our equities, which we run general, they are considered under the pool. When we strip those away and we're looking at what the actual investments we have, they're about 20%. So I was trying to make that clear.
Thank you, Chair. It's been a while since I've been on the pension committee, but I'm up to date where we are. But I do remember a couple of years ago, we increased the allocation to equities, especially US equities. Obviously, that's done quite well. That was my decision. It's on increasing that. But at what stage do we review the strategic allocations at 6.2? What? Because I'm not that up to date with where we are, but there's definitely this thing of inflation could be around the corner, which in my opinion would hurt equities quite badly if central banks start to move. So when would we be looking at tactical decisions like reducing our allocation of equities and increasing, for example, cash?
So in terms of an asset allocation review, that happens fairly regularly, but that sort of depends on members, how they feel about what's happening sort of with the market. Generally speaking, the most time when we do a review is around valuation. So the idea is we try and make sure that our investments are in line with our actual liabilities. So at the next valuation, there will definitely be another review based on what that.
That's next year.
That's next year. But in between, we can make decisions. Like, for example, the last few decisions that were made, investing into infrastructure, for example, and going into the market, there was sort of in between valuations. So our consultants, I don't know if Alex would like to say a few words. They actually do a regular monitoring of our portfolio, and they would advise us if they feel there's a need for us to change some of the application. I don't know if you want to say anything, Alex.
Yeah, no, I think particularly on the point about inflation, I think it is something that we're definitely aware of, and it has factored into some of the discussions that we've been having recently, and probably the best example of that is the decision to retain an allocation to index-linked gilts of 7% in the portfolio. So there was a discussion as to whether to sell all of our gilts. But the decision was taken to retain them, and the inflation sensitivity that they provide was a key kind of part of the strategic rationale for doing that. In addition, allocating to the London Fund and some of the property investments that we have as well as, of course, the renewable energy infrastructure. Some of those alternative investments should be relatively resilient in an inflationary scenario that should help the fund sort of be protected from any negative impact on some other parts of the portfolio. What I would say is, generally, the fund is a very long-term investor. The sort of time frame for investment is measured in sort of many decades, and so we tend not to take sort of more tactical calls. So it probably wouldn't be the case that we would be suggesting reducing the allocation to equities and holding proceeds in cash. It's more about making sure that our strategic allocation can be resilient to a number of different market environments, which is something that we do think is the case, but is something that we review on a regular basis, not just around the actuarial valuation, but also, whenever we believe something needs to be considered, then we will table a paper.
Just follow up. Okay, thank you. I can see making a strategic decision might be you need to build up to, but the over investment currently in equities at 5.5% in table 2. You see total equity 5.5% over investment. Warrants looking at it, in my opinion. And although we're under invested in property, I wouldn't particularly think that that currently is a great inflation hedge, because when interest rates go up, I think the property market will also be negatively impacted. So I would just like to suggest that we review the overinvestment in equities and consider something like cash to be sidelines for a short while until you make a strategic decision.
Yes. So I think there are two different questions. I think in terms of whether you would, make a tactical change to the investment strategy, I think that's not historically the way that we've probably done things, but we definitely have looked at the allocation relative to the strategic benchmark and rebalanced where necessary. And I would agree with you that an overweight position of nearly 6% to equities is probably something that is worth considering to taking rebalancing action. I also note that it's possible that overweight position will have increased since the end of June, because equity markets have continued to perform strongly since then. And so it might be worth having a look at a more up-to-date position if that's possible, and potentially officers having a discussion, and we're happy to be part of that discussion in terms of whether we could be taking any rebalancing activity.
Similar question, I guess. Where is the threshold for action, like longer term action? So in terms of an inflationary period, how long would it have to go on for what kind of action if interest rates starts to increase? But what would that threshold for action be, and over what time scale you have to take action?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there is a serious market event that's caused by a spike in inflation, for example, then we would be definitely raising with officers and with the committee, out of cycle for meetings. So we would be looking to set up a call to discuss the possible impact. And a good example of that is COVID last year. So we were engaging with officers as to the market impact of COVID on the equity portfolio, for example. Not at a meeting, but setting up calls. I think if it's a more gradual impact, so if we do just enter into a period of higher inflation, then that will be captured by the more regular reviews of investment strategy that we do. And so, it's something that we would pick up, for example, as part of the actuarial valuation that's scheduled for 31st of March next year. So I think there's kind of a dual layer of protection there, in the sense that if something really significant does happen and we think action is required, we would proactively raise it. But if it's something which is more gradual and more of a kind of structural trend, then it would be picked up by the next regular review.
Okay, Councillor Burren, and then Councillor Ross.
By the time the central banks do raise rates, if they do, they're also involved. So I don't think it will be a gradual move. This would be a huge secular shift if we did start to see the inflation that people think might be transitory. That's going to be a very big cyclical shift, structural shift in the markets for the last 20 years. But be on top of that. The second one, perhaps we could just look at where we were, say, 5 years ago, because I'm pretty sure it's around then that we increased this share of equities, which is what everyone did, because bond yields were so low. And so everybody's got the same position. And they'll all do the same thing. If interest rates start out, they will come out of equities back to realign with bonds. So perhaps have a look at where we were 5 or 6 years ago when we made that strategic shift.
So I couldn't gather all of that, but yeah, I mean, certainly the allocation to equities, I think, has increased over the more recent past, and that is obviously a decision which, in performance terms, so far has been beneficial. You know, it obviously is a relatively high part of the overall risk that we have in the investment strategy, but it does, you know, we do have other diversifying asset classes as well, and I think if you look at someone like Rafa, who are our absolute return manager, they actually completely agree with your thesis. So they think that we are going to enter into a period of much higher inflation than we've seen over the past couple of decades. And so they've positioned their portfolio to be resilient to that sort of scenario. So it is an example of whereby, you know, we do have a long-term structural allocation to equities in order to generate kind of high level of returns over long periods of time. But some of the other asset classes that we have in the portfolio should perform well if our equity portfolio doesn't. And I think I would put index-linked gilts as another asset class that sits alongside the rougher portfolio, you know, in terms of that bucket. I guess it's quite difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen in markets and what central banks are going to do, because I guess if we did see a period of inflation that was, you know, markedly higher, you know, that doesn't necessarily feed through to central banks raising interest rates sharply and straight away. I guess traditional economic theory would suggest that they would do, but I think we have, you know, financial markets have become addicted to low central bank interest rates, and so they may well be willing to allow inflation to run a little hot for longer than previously might have been envisaged in the past. So, you know, and again, that would be an example where index-linked bonds would perform extremely strongly because the real yield would decline significantly under that scenario.
Make a suggestion, Chair. For us as officers to take an action to look at the current overweights within this portfolio with a view to rebalance it to its strategic asset allocation. I do take the view that being overweight in equities is probably not the best move for us right now. So we can take that as an action and we rebalance and get back at the next meeting if members are happy with that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to finally add, I mean, I think our central thesis does still remain quite positive on growth assets. I think we do acknowledge that there's a tail risk from high inflation, but I think the level of support that we've seen from sort of governments and the number of the sort of numbers for economic growth that we're seeing as a result of that, you know, are truly astonishing, and generally very high periods of economic growth have been positive for equity markets. So our kind of central thesis is relatively positive, but we do acknowledge there are risks, and we absolutely support the idea of rebalancing to make sure that we're not, you know, taking more risk than we would want to.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to reiterate what Pat now answered. So, front page of the Evening Standard today says that inflation it's the biggest jump since 1996 in the last month. And it's the highest it's been for a good 10 years or so. And in the next agenda item, Paul is saying that it could hit 4% by the end of the year. So I fully agree with that. We need to rebalance.
Okay, so the original recommendation was to note the information provided. Are you suggesting an alternative?
Yes, so I'm suggesting that as officers, we take the views of the committee on board and look at rebalancing the portfolio back to its strategic asset allocation.
Is that agreed?
Yes.
Okay. This item also has some exempt information in the exempt section of the meeting, but both, it says here, both parts are just to note.
Yes, that was the report as well. If they had a question that was to be raised, you can raise that with the exempt part of the section.
I'm just going to raise the fact that I do need to change the governance part of the is it the audit report needs to be changed to show that I'm a fair member of the pension fund. I'm a fair member of the pension fund.
I see.
So I think just to clarify, it won't actually say your name.
No, it's fine. Yeah.
We go on to item 11, local government pension scheme update. Can I now invite officers to introduce the report?
Oh, sorry, just one on that, just an administrative thing, on the table 6.2. Is it possible not to add another column, because that may confuse a subtable that would just have the changes in percent, where they were in the valuation points? So you have the valuation in 2020, and valuation in 2021, and you can see certainly who was worth more than they were a year ago. But if you could have a column which was a percentage change, you can see what's done really well, what's done bad.
Yeah, so
Either add it in there or separate table.
So I hope that's been picked up, but yes, we'll definitely look to see how we can add that into the next report.
So can we go on to item 11 now, please? Government pension scheme.
All right, so item 11, the local government pension scheme update. So this paper is actually being drafted by the independent advisor. Again, unfortunately, he's not here to be able to present this item. So I'll have a good attempt at presenting it and giving you some of the updates that are happening in the local government pension scheme. There are four sort of key sub areas that are covered within the report. The main one is there are a couple of consultations that have been long awaited that are due to come anytime now. There's also an update on the age discrimination case, commonly referred to as McLeod. Been involved in McLeod, so just giving an update on what's happening with that. And then there's also an update on the pension regulator, not that relevant to the LDPS, but also just good information for the to be aware of. And then an increase on the normal minimum pension age from the 6th of April 2028. So the first one is on the two consultations. The first consultation is to do with pooling. As members will be aware, the Harrogate Pension Fund is a member of the London Collective Investment Vehicle, which is the pool. We are one of 32 borrowers that are involved with that pooling vehicle. As we've discussed earlier, we have several investments within the pool. The issue that's been widely debated is there are 8 asset pools across the country, and the way that they are all set up in terms of their governance structure, in terms of how they invest, in terms of how they assist their owner councils or authorities is very different. So the government is looking at bringing on forward a consultation that will streamline that a bit more and make sure that pooling across the country is more in a similar framework. We haven't actually seen the consultation yet. At the moment, all I've heard is a few people talking about what might be in that consultation. But I think the recommendation in the paper is we need to be aware of that consultation is coming. It's supposed to come before the end of the year. Once it has, as officers, we will review it and feedback to the committee and board in terms of what we do, our views, and what we think is best for the Harrogate Pension Fund. So that's just one on asset pooling, which is a very key area that's likely to happen. I think just maybe to give a bit of background, pooling has been around for a while, but I think in 2019, the government did try and bring forward a consultation that was set to do this, but this is such a difficult problem to assess just because there are 88 authorities, administrative authorities in the country, and one's got different asset allocation, different regions, and it's been like that historically. So it's a difficult problem for them to assess. And when they initially put forward that consultation, they had to share with because the details of the consultation were sort of queried by members. So the idea is since then, there's obviously been the pandemic, there's been Brexit, and the government has been focused on so delivering those. It now feels like they're shifting back into this area of asset pooling, which seems to be one of the key part of their agenda, and obviously has got more implications on the value. So that one, I don't know if there are any questions, or if you like me to sort of carry on with the report and the questions again.
What are the risks?
Which concepts are
What you just spoken about, you know?
it's sort of, there are many. If they were to change pooling, for example, one of the big questions is on who sets the asset allocation, who's responsible for that. So the pensions committee and board is responsible for that. If they were to streamline, it might be something that they'll feel differently about. But given how difficult it is to administer this pension, that's not something that we would we'll need to see what those regulations would look like, because that might mean that the work that we do here is going to be very different, and the expectations of the committee and board will be very different. So it's important for us to know, so that you know what is sort of your roles in terms of setting as allocation. There are other risks in terms of how it's going to be implemented across country, but I think until we see the actual document, it's hard for me at the moment to sort of speculation.
That's in terms of
Just on the TCFD, the task force of the climate-related financial disclosure, we spoke it last time that we thought actually for us to do something voluntarily, let's say, would actually be quite an enhancement to our standing as a pension committee board. And I think at that time, the committee thought it would be a good idea for us to start looking at anyway. How, obviously, the time horizon for this, we don't really know when it's going to happen. Is it something that we should do and consider when we do it, how we do it?
Yes, I was going to move on to that one next. So
okay, so
I'm just happy to, if everyone's happy with that, I can sort of shed a bit more light on that.
Yeah.
So the task force for climate related financial disclosures is the next consultation that will be coming out. This one we have a bit more certainty on when it's coming. The expectation is it will be coming next month. Essentially what's happened is the DWP, which is responsible for a lot of the corporate schemes and some of the public sector schemes, has already issued out its guidelines on what that TCFD reporting looks like. So that's mandatory for a lot of those schemes, I think starting 2020 or next year actually. But those guidelines do not apply for the pension scheme. So essentially what the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Housing, Communities and MCOG, they are coming up with their own set of regulations that will be mandatory, that all the administrative authorities will have to comply by. It will involve producing a report and seeing what that report looks like. There will be different sets of metrics that's going to be included in that consultation. My understanding is there will be two metrics that you definitely have to, one on like so how you measure carbon, so that that's consistent across all the boroughs, not all the boroughs, but all the administrative authorities. But there will also be an option for the fund itself to select one other metric that they feel would be beneficial to them, that would be useful to share with their members. So this is going to be interesting because depending on the timelines, the consultation will be for 2 weeks. So probably the next meeting will know what that consultation will look like and give you updates. But essentially means that will be mandatory. We don't know when exactly they are planning on enforcing that, but I would assume that sooner rather than later. So the plan that we have is to put that into the forward plan so we can refresh that training. I think at that point as well, we'll be more familiar with what would actually be required. So that training will be much more informed. And then look at them putting in an action plan as to how we can meet those requirements for TCFD reporting. Just to say, we can also get support from our consultants. They support us on that work. Also, the pool is doing some work that should be able to support us in terms of producing that report. But another key thing about TCFD that just to highlight to members is it's not just about reporting those numbers and seeing what those numbers look like. It's meant to be a risk assessment too. So we need to be able to look at the numbers and see where our weak areas are, or what areas could be a risk, or what areas could be good opportunities, and then use it as a more holistic tool rather than as a mandatory we have to produce this report. So I do agree that we probably should be doing more, and I'm sure we'll be getting some support from our advisors on that. Okay, to move on. Right. Okay, so the next one is on the McLeod case. Just the update is essentially the government has now confirmed that they will be introducing a bill that will look to basically put those remedial regulations in place to make sure that those who are implemented by McLeod will have that we're able to actually cover them in terms of like the LGPS regulations. For those who might not be familiar with McLeod, basically when the regulations changed in 2014, the LGPS used to be a final salary scheme. It is now a career average scheme. There were members who were affected who were within 10 years of retiring. They felt very discriminated against on the age basis, and and this was all across all schemes within the public sector. So one of the people who took forward sort of a challenge to the government was a judge called McLeod, and the whole case ended up being termed as McLeod case. So you hear a lot of people talking about McLeod. So essentially, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The government found that they had discriminated against those members, so they had to rectify that situation. So essentially, this bill attempts to do that. At the moment, we don't know what the impact is on the fund in terms of liability side or how much of the work we need to do to be able to meet those remedial actions. It's something that I know Nigel's already started looking at, but at the moment we can't provide much more of a bigger update, but it's something that we'll definitely find out.
That's Ross. I thought we said we were going to start looking at the infected animals. So, I mean, this has, as I say, been going on for this 2 years. It's not long. We always knew that it would affect us, so I thought we were going to start doing that.
Can I just say about that in terms of the history? So the actuaries now dating in the accounts. It has 26 statements, and it's not really so significant in terms of the impact of liabilities. The impact is really significant, however, in the pension accounts that go back to 6. Once we let them know their pension figure is slightly different, that is a more significant impact on just monetary effect in sales and the administration.
So that's a big job of work, so I'm not actually started.
A big job. We don't have the legislation. So tell us exactly how what exactly it is we need to do. What we can do at the moment is kind of degree of projection.
But do we know how many people would, we know the timescale of what those people would be, so we'd be able to know how many bills we'd have to recalculate.
I'm not sure we can say that with any certainty. I don't know if Nigel wants to comment on it.
I understand that the legislation, when it comes in, will aim to have all those individuals affected by this discrimination case rectified by 2024. So we have commissioned some work with our pensions administration software supplier to start collecting the necessary data, so we can start to try to identify the individuals involved. In fact, the first part of that work starts tomorrow when they start running reports through our pensions admin system. Then they will start going out to employers to gather the necessary data. It's not going to be an easy task. Obviously, we have a lot of ceased employers, previous contractors, but we have a plan in place to collect as much of that data as we possibly can. And then we can start to assess the size of the remediation task in terms of membership. And then when we find out what the remediation rules are from the local government association, once the legislation has gone through, then we can try and put a finger on exactly what the administrative impact is in terms of the resource that we're going to need to be able to put these people back in the position they should be.
This might be a really, really simplistic thing, but I was just assuming you used to have a big list of everybody who's ever been paying into the pension fund.
Okay.
But it's a list of people. Okay. No, I know. But you would have an idea of when they were employed and you get the dates, and then
It's more specific data about
Yeah.
2012. It's not something they actually make sure it's not really cool.
Yeah.
Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah. Well, it was the case that when we transitioned from being a final salary scheme to being a care scheme, there were certain elements of the data that we didn't need to capture, and so we stopped doing so. We now need to go back and recreate that. which is where the difficulty comes in.
Big job nonetheless.
One question, Chair. Yeah, it's the pension scheme that pays for that. Or does the government say, well, we've made a mistake and give you extra money to sort it out?
No, unfortunately, we're not going to be getting any extra support. That's something that the pension government.
Even though they got it wrong with the crowd.
It's unfortunately.
Unfortunately, normally the way.
That's unfortunately how it works. Right, so I can move on to the next item. The next subheading, there's not really much to update on that, just a summary that there are 15 TPR codes of practice. Only one of them is the one that's relevant to the local government pension scheme. Essentially, they are proposing to reduce their 15 to 6, and they're combining 5 of the other, or 10 of the other existing codes into one code, and that's one that applies to the LGPS. So the consultation was actually finished in May. We didn't participate in that consultation exercise, and at the moment they're just reviewing the responses to then decide whether they go ahead with their proposed change. But the implications on our fund won't be that material. Just for the next one that will be quite interesting to people who are members in the scheme is the increase of our normal minimum pension age from 2028. So in July of this year, the government announced that they will be increasing the normal minimum pension age, which is the age where members can actually start access their benefits. It's not their retirement age, but they can elect to have some of their benefits at that age. It's been 55 for I think a while. But they're now increasing that to 57. The rationale behind that is they always wanted to be 10 years to the date when they retire, and the government increasing state retirement age to 67. So this is just to say that they're now going back like a 10-year difference. Obviously, the implication was quite a lot because people have to consider what happens for their retirements. But we do have 6 years as a pension team or as a pension fund to decide how best we can communicate that to our members so that they are aware. Because I want to be aware of that change in their scheme, some processes. So just on them, so that they're aware.
I was just going to ask, my impression is that the government wants to increase the pension age incrementally over the next 10, 20 years. So do we know, or do you as officers know whether that's going to happen or not? Have you heard any whisperings?
No, I've not had any whispers particularly about it increasing, but I would not be surprised if that's the direction they decided to go. Given on the basis of a lot of the actual assumptions of people living longer, people being able to apply. I do feel this is kind of the start of what will be more changes. The thing is that when they propose such a change, especially with what they have to allow enough time. Right? So if they were to change that, they would probably be about it. I don't think they'll change.
The reverse of that was, as Councillor Devon used to say, age, what's the expression you just used? Age projections have started to go down over the last decade. So, any ideas on whether that is going to
So if the rates of their increase, I think it's that.
but
People are still living
it's
off
still
longer. They're not, yeah. So we still expect on balance people to now be able to run that. It's just I think at the next valuation we have the actuals, it'll be very interesting to ask them what the basis of their assumptions. But their assumptions that's a little more. But there's still people still living longer way to the time. What's for the pension? That's the biggest risk.
when you say to last one, ask me.
No, so we use the points actually handles.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'll welcome the opportunity to tell you all about what's happening in that space.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
The recommendations for this report are to note the independent advisor's LGPS update paper appended as Appendix 1 to the report. Is that agreed? Item 12, Local Authority Pension Fund Forum. voting update.
Yeah, so this one, Zad, doing this noting item for members. This is a standing item that is brought to, I think, every meeting. Historically, the pensions committee board is always wanting to know how we vote out in terms of our investment money is voted in line with LAP's recommendations. We are members of LAP. So LAP do send out regular recommendations, and sometimes the investment managers vote in line with LAP, sometimes we don't. So what we do is provide a report to members as to what happened in the last period. So on page 2 of this particular report is just a summary of the key resolution that was sent by LAP and how our main entities manager also voted.
Do you have any questions? No? So can we note this report? Yeah. And go on to item 13, risk register.
Right, so the next item is the risk register. Again, it's another standing item, although it is a bit different. What we've always done in Haringey is whenever we update the risk register, we look at a particular area of the risk and then sort of bring it to the committee and board to comment on whether they feel that we're assessing those risks appropriately or if more work needs to be done. What I've actually done since I've joined is just undertaking an exercise of trying to revamp some of those risks and sort of update them, looking at the system that we're in place and the work that we're currently carrying out, and provide an update to the pensions committee and board, just for your initial feedback and some thoughts on how we sort of rated some of those risks, or if you feel that there's more work that needs to be done. We will be going through all the other sections. It does take quite a long time to try and update the risk register. There are quite a lot of risks, but we will be bringing subsequent changes to future meetings. So in appendix 1 to this report, the risk register, just maybe to explain the layout a little bit more. We have about 12 risks, and they are into different risk groups. So the one that we're looking at today is particularly on investment risk. And then initially we just describe what that risk is, and then what is its score, just if we did nothing about it. How do you think that's going to impact the fund? We then look at the controls that we currently have in place in the mitigation, so some of the actions that we're requiring now. So for example, the first risk that we have is on the ongoing COVID-19 outbreak. Unfortunately, it's one of those that we don't have control over the actual outbreak or the responses to the outbreak. But the things that we can do is, for example, look at asset allocation, discussed earlier, see whether we're on the right identify that we need the right instruments. Is it doing what we expect it to do? And then also as officers, as Mrs. alluded to, we'll be in regular contact with them to make sure that we are positioned appropriately. So in terms of the actual risk scores, a score of 20 and above. I think a score of 15 and above. Let's see if I can find number 7. I'll tell you. So yes, a score of 15 and above would be classed as a red. It's something that we need to pay extra attention to. So the idea is you are trying to bring that level of risk down. Anything between 20 and 15 would be classed as an amber risk. It's something that we are doing something about. It's not at the top of our agenda, but we still have to do some work on it. And then risk that are rated green, usually risk that we feel we have reasonable control over, and we're doing the best that we can to keep those low. And they don't have as much of a material to the fund. So that's just sort of summarizing that appendix for 12 risks. So
That's the boss.
On the bottom of page 71, you've reduced the risk of Brexit from 3 down to 2. I was wondered because there's all sorts of problems economically in this country.
I think the rationale regarding reducing the risk is mainly to do with how our asset allocation is invested. So most of our assets are not based in the UK, so they're able to absorb those different risks, especially if you look at the global, most of the equities, they're basically mainly the companies in America. So we don't have that direct impact in terms of that risk. And also we do feel that now that Brexit has been agreed, it's reasonably easy to see what those risks are, assess them, whereas at the beginning, previously before the deal, we didn't know what the risk would be like. So we do feel we sort of going out in the world for us to become our
Let's look at 6 about cash flow. It says that's on page 72, third one.
Yeah.
Obviously, bringing it back to cash flow. And we see that I've always found cash flow to be a hard one to get the information. It is mentioned on page 120 in that report, which just says in one course we paid out 2.5 million, typically 2.5 million. It's something I like to look at, cash flow. So can we see that the last annual cash flow review? And where in the papers do we measure that risk metric to know if you've given it the right level of risk?
Councillor Berry, was the last time the fund did a investment strategy review, which was following the 2019 valuation. That was part of the papers that were presented to the committee. Over the next few years was considered. That was what the main themes it's in the looked at in terms of the changes to the investment strategy at that time. A number of changes were made to increase the level of income from investments. So it has been taken to appreciate the time. I'm sure we could include that high level cash flow in what's been brought.
I think it would, because that's 2019. We've had 2 years of information.
Yeah.
It'd be good to know.
Doesn't mean it hasn't been done.
Yeah, it'd be good to see it, because I couldn't find it.
Yes, so I think this maybe to add to that as well, I can just provide an update based on the actual accounts for the last year. So I think if you go on to page 32 of your agenda packs, there is what's called the pension fund account, which is basically the revenue account of the pension fund. So just giving so people an opportunity to get to that page. But page 32. 32. So there is that first table on the left-hand side. You've got the line for contributions. Contributions were about 48 million that we got in. And the benefits that we paid out were about 51 million. We then pay expenses for the ongoing management of our actual investments. So we call those management expenses. They came in about 6 million. And then we actually had the investment income, which is back on what Thomas was mentioning that the review that was done last time. One of the big changes was actually in the LC multi-asset credit fund, where before we were reinvesting those proceeds. So I think Alex mentioned it earlier that they pay regular income because they hold bonds and people pay the interest that kind of gets paid to us as income. So that decision to switch that from reinvesting to then paying into the fund has actually done really well for us. It's the majority of that 12 million that you're seeing in the line of investment income. So on a net basis, the fund is in negative income, but I do accept what Thomas is saying. There's a regular update you would be helpful and try and summarize that on a more regular basis. But just basing it on the final account, we don't think that's an area that's.
The one you just missed is crazy to negative is the net withdrawals one. The 11 million or 12 million net withdrawals.
Yeah, so if you add that to the line.
Oh, that's the 48, 51, and 6.
Yes, they're all added together.
So the thing I would look at is the negative one, plus the 12, 6, 8, 7, which that's basically that is in counter terms the revenue position of payments out.
Slightly positive.
Slightly positive, yeah. And that's it, to action.
Yeah. And on the investment risk 10 on page 72, again, where we look for a metric that tells us that we've not got an asset liability mismatch in terms of holding lots of maybe, I'll use a market phrase, I can't think of the short duration assets versus long duration liabilities. A pension fund you've got to pay pensions for quite a long time. You don't have all your money short term So where do we look to see if that risk is?
So just put me, what's the risk?
The mismatching of assets and liabilities, investment risk 10.
10, right.
Where do we look in the pact to see what is the length of the liabilities of the fund versus the expected length of the assets?
That would be very difficult to do on a quarterly basis. And certainly with valuation, that is something that is a chart of the valuation and that's our liability.
You look at that.
I think any kind of immediate concerns around that we would look to Mercer to officers if there was a kind of short-term market event where this could lead to that being a concern for us. But I don't think that is something that we would look at on a quarterly basis as a matter of course, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Hi, Thomas. Is it just worth reiterating? So you've got the actuarial valuation coming up next year. That focuses on the liabilities and the overall sort of, funding status, and then that would typically be sort of followed by an investment strategy review. So the questions that have been asked is very good, but there's a very long term in nature. But there's always a kind of a 3 to 4 year cycle in which these long term issues are assessed.
Any other comments or questions? No? Shall we note the report and go on to item 14, forward plan?
So item 14 is the forward plan, and this is just for members to sort of give us your views on what we have in the plan. I think Councillor Vincent has already sort of picked up a few things that he'd like to include. But I don't know if there was anything else that you've seen in the plan that you might feel maybe not included that we should include. So to work on those. And then additionally, just to sort of manage about the training that is available to members, I've sort of put in links to some websites. Unfortunately, there isn't any direct sort of training that's currently available that we could list here. But if anything does happen, we meetings that that's of interest to members. And then just on Appendix 3, just to sort of bring to members' attention the responses to the TPR public sector toolkit and the training needs analysis. I may not have got everything right, just to sort of reference. If you feel that that record is not correct, please do let me know when you have to sort of change it. But for those who have not completed the training needs analysis, that's very important. It helps us sort of provide training for members on an ongoing basis and help us also inform what of interest in members to learn more about the better sort of exercise your duties. So just to highlight those few things to members and
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Chair. I might tread on a few toes here, but about 2 or maybe 2.5 years ago, we agreed as a committee that there wouldn't be a high turnover of membership. And yet, on page 79, everyone in one group on the council has changed. I know Pat was on this committee before, but what happened to that agreement between two whips who agreed that there wouldn't be a high turnover of membership? I think that's a political question, so I might be pointing that at the chair.
I wasn't aware of that, I'm afraid. So,
We agreed.
unfortunately, the previous chair is now in cabinet, so it can't.
I understand that, but we've had, as is the vice chair. Yeah. But we've had, in my recollection, 7 years I've been on this committee, we've had 5 chairs of the committee, I think. As I recall. And we did, I mean, Councillor Bevan did push that there wouldn't be a turnover on this committee in the council. It's not a political committee, I mean, we all agree that. But we agreed that there wouldn't be a high turnover, so I just wondered what had happened. I'm sure you can't answer it, Chair. Right. But I think
it would be helpful to, even if, because we're on the full plan, like if we're talking about in March, like for us as a committee to say, actually, we should reiterate that concern that this committee, out of all the committees in the entire council, should want to prevent that turnover. Just because it, like when I first started, you can build that up over time. It's early on if you do have lots of people coming in. And then start fresh.
And there's a legal requirement to do the training. Perhaps you take it back to your chief whip. That's my only comment on that agenda item.
You have any other comments? Go on to item 15, new items of urgent business, none received so far.
None, Chair.
And dates of future meetings. Dates of future meetings. 2nd of December, 24th of January 2022 and 15th of March. And go on to item 17, London Collective Investment Vehicle Multi-Asset Credit Review. Can I invite officers to introduce the report?
So Chair, can I ask that we close the public section of the meeting? The information that we're going to be discussing in the next element is commercially sensitive, so we'd like to have that in an exempt meeting. So I don't know if you know what the process is.
Yeah, sure. So if there are any questions that could be public that don't involve the confidential information, members can ask those now. But if members don't have any public questions, we can move to the next item, which is the excluding the press and public.
I want one thing, because it's sort of topical for every workplace, is we've got some of our advisors and so forth remotely joining the meeting, and we have had issues hearing some of the points. So if we just have a review of when we go back to normal in terms of everybody's in the room, so people's contributions can be heard. Because obviously we pay our advisors fees for their advice, we want them to be able to hear us and us hear them.
If it just helps, was to say we have issues in some rooms, so lots of the council committees are not able to have it.
We have to find a way. We have to try and find a way.
We'll now be considering items 19 to 22, which will contain exempt information. We will be moving to exclude the press and public from the remainder of the meeting to consider this exempt information, as defined under paragraph 3, part 1, schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972. Is the exclusion of the press and public for these items agreed by members? If anyone has any comments or objections to this, please speak now. I'll check this is agreed. Thank you. That marks the end of the public section of this meeting. We will pause while the recording of the meeting stops, and we will restart the exempt part of the meeting.